The night the future quietly stepped forward did not arrive with a proclamation or a headline, but with a glance, a gesture, and a presence that no one inside Royal Albert Hall could ignore. Beneath its golden arches, where history is not just remembered but felt, a moment unfolded between Prince George and Catherine, Princess of Wales, that seemed to carry more weight than the ceremony itself. And here is the question that lingered in the air from the very beginning. Was this simply a young boy attending a solemn royal event, or was the monarchy quietly introducing its future far earlier than expected? From the instant George stepped out of the car, the tone shifted in a way even seasoned royal watchers did not anticipate. His posture was not accidental, his expression not uncertain, and his pace not hurried. It was measured, composed, almost as if he understood that every step forward was being recorded not just by cameras, but by history itself. Catherine followed closely, her presence calm yet deliberate, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, and in that single gesture, something deeper revealed itself. This was not just maternal reassurance, it was guidance, timing, and silent instruction all at once. Have you ever noticed how the smallest gestures often carry the biggest meaning? As they entered the hall, the atmosphere adjusted around them. Conversation softened, cameras subtly reoriented, and attention gravitated not toward spectacle, but toward something far more compelling. The quiet alignment between a mother shaping a future king and a son beginning to understand what that truly means. What made this moment extraordinary was not just George's presence, but how naturally he carried it. There was no visible hesitation, no sign of overwhelm, only a quiet absorption of everything unfolding around him. And that leads to a deeper thought. Can leadership really begin this early, not through training, but through experience? Inside, the symbolism became even more striking. George was seated between King Charles III and Catherine, forming a visual narrative that almost felt too precise to be coincidental. On one side sat the reigning monarch, representing tradition, continuity, and the weight of the crown. On the other sat Catherine, embodying modernity, emotional intelligence, and the evolving face of the monarchy. And in the middle, a 12-year-old boy, absorbing both worlds at once. Was this placement simply protocol, or was it a carefully constructed message about the monarchy's direction? Throughout the ceremony, it was Catherine who anchored the moment in a way that never demanded attention, yet commanded it completely. She did not overshadow George, nor did she step back entirely. Instead, she operated in a space that only the most skilled figures in public life truly understand, the balance between visibility and restraint. A slight lean toward him before a solemn segment, a soft whisper timed perfectly before silence, a reassuring glance when the atmosphere grew heavy. These were not random actions. They were part of an unspoken rhythm. And if you look closely, you begin to see something remarkable. This is how legacy is transferred, not through speeches, but through presence. George's response to that guidance was equally telling. He did not mimic, he absorbed. He did not perform, he participated. His hands remained still, his gaze focused, and during the most emotional parts of the ceremony, his stillness spoke louder than any words could. At one point, as the hall fell into silence, he bowed his head with a deliberateness that felt almost instinctive. Not rushed, not forced, but understood. And that raises a powerful question. How much of this is taught, and how much of it is already within him? Meanwhile, the reactions around him added layers to the unfolding story. King Charles occasionally glanced toward George, not with casual curiosity, but with something more reflective, almost evaluative. It was the look of someone who understands time, legacy, and responsibility in a way few others can. Nearby, Queen Camilla maintained her composed demeanor, her expressions measured, adding a subtle contrast to the warmth between Catherine and George. Even these small dynamics contributed to a larger narrative, one where attention is gradually, almost inevitably, shifting. But what truly defined the night was not hierarchy, not protocol, and not even tradition. It was the connection between Catherine and George, a connection that unfolded quietly yet unmistakably. When their eyes met during the ceremony, it was not a fleeting glance, it was communication. When she gave a small nod, it was not instruction, it was affirmation. And when he responded, it was not obedience, it was understanding. Can you see how rare that kind of alignment is, especially under such intense public scrutiny? As the evening progressed, something subtle but undeniable happened. The focus moved away from the idea of George attending in place of Prince William and shifted toward something far more significant. He was no longer just present. He was participating in a role. Not fully, not officially, but enough to signal that the transition from observation to responsibility has already begun. And here is where the narrative deepens. Was this moment planned as a simple substitution, or was it always meant to test something much bigger? By the time the ceremony neared its end, the image of Catherine and George together had already begun to define the evening. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was authentic. When they rose, when they moved in sync, when they descended the steps side by side, it felt less like a public appearance and more like a glimpse into the future of the monarchy itself. A future shaped not by grand declarations, but by quiet preparation. And as they stepped out of the hall, one question lingered more strongly than any other. If this is how the future begins, gently, deliberately, and almost unnoticed, then how much of it is already unfolding right in front of us without us even realizing it? If the first part of the evening belonged to the quiet, almost cinematic connection between Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Prince George, then what followed shifted the narrative into something far more unexpected, because this was the moment when observers began to realize that George was not simply present as a symbolic figure, but was actually stepping into the rhythm of royal duty with a level of composure that even seasoned insiders did not fully anticipate. And here is the question that immediately started circulating among those watching closely. When does a moment stop being ceremonial and start becoming a quiet test of leadership? As George settled into his seat inside Royal Albert Hall, the energy around him subtly changed, not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in the kind of shift that only becomes clear when you compare expectation with reality. Many assumed there would be small signs of nervousness, perhaps a restless glance, a slight adjustment, or even a moment of distraction, because after all, he is still a child stepping into an environment built for seasoned public figures. But what unfolded instead felt almost disarming in its steadiness. His posture remained aligned, his gaze forward, and his movements measured, as if he had already internalized the unspoken rules of presence that define royal life. So ask yourself this. Can composure like that truly be taught, or does it reveal something deeper about who he is becoming? What made this even more compelling was how naturally he mirrored the tone of those around him, particularly King Charles III, whose own stillness has long defined the visual language of monarchy. There was a moment, subtle yet powerful, where George adjusted his posture almost in sync with the king, not as imitation, but as alignment. It was the kind of detail that could easily go unnoticed, yet for those paying attention, it signaled something profound, the early formation of instinct. And that leads to another thought worth considering. Are we witnessing preparation, or are we witnessing emergence? Meanwhile, Catherine continued to guide without ever appearing to guide, which is perhaps the most sophisticated form of leadership in itself. During one of the ceremony's more emotionally charged segments, she leaned ever so slightly toward George, offering a quiet word that never reached the microphones but clearly reached him. His response was immediate yet understated, a small nod, a steadying breath, and a return to stillness. This exchange lasted only seconds, but it carried the weight of years of preparation. Have you ever noticed how the strongest forms of mentorship are often invisible to everyone except the one receiving them? As the performances unfolded, particularly during the more solemn musical tributes, George's attentiveness became one of the most talked-about elements of the evening. He did not shift impatiently, did not disengage, and did not allow the length of the ceremony to break his focus. Instead, he appeared to absorb the atmosphere, not passively, but with a kind of awareness that felt unusually mature. At one point, as a choir's voices filled the hall, Catherine briefly glanced toward him, not to correct, but to check, and what she found seemed to reassure her completely. That single glance, and his quiet acknowledgement, reinforced something viewers could not ignore. This was not a performance, this was participation. And here is a question that naturally follows. How often do we see someone so young carry such visible awareness of responsibility? But the story did not unfold in isolation, because the reactions of those around him added layers that made the moment even more complex. King Charles, for instance, leaned slightly toward George during a brief pause, speaking just a few words that were inaudible to the audience, yet deeply significant in context. George listened intently, his expression unchanged, before offering a polite nod. It was a fleeting interaction, but one that hinted at something larger, a quiet acknowledgement from one generation to the next. And when you think about it, what do those few words represent? Encouragement, instruction, or perhaps recognition. Across the row, other senior royals observed with equal interest, their reactions subtle yet telling. There were nods, measured glances, and moments of quiet approval that collectively built a narrative unfolding beneath the surface. Even Queen Camilla, known for her composed public demeanor, maintained a carefully neutral expression whenever attention drifted toward George, adding a layer of intrigue that did not go unnoticed by royal commentators. It raises an interesting point. When attention begins to shift within such a historic institution, how do those within it respond? Yet, perhaps the most defining moment of this phase of the evening came during the silence, a moment that has historically tested even the most experienced figures. As the hall fell completely still, George lowered his head slowly, not abruptly, not hesitantly, but with a deliberate calm that seemed to echo the gravity of the occasion. He remained motionless, fully present, fully engaged, and completely aligned with the significance of the tribute. There were no distractions, no breaks in focus, only stillness. And in that stillness, something became undeniably clear. This was not just about learning protocol, this was about understanding meaning. So consider this. Can true leadership begin with the ability to hold silence with sincerity? As the ceremony resumed, the shift in perception became almost impossible to ignore. What had started as curiosity gradually evolved into recognition, not officially declared, not formally acknowledged, but felt collectively by those watching. George was no longer being viewed as a child attending an important event, but as someone beginning to step into a role, however gradually that role may unfold. And here is where the narrative naturally transitions. If this was only the beginning, if this was only a single evening shaped by circumstance, then what does it suggest about what comes next? Because what happened inside Royal Albert Hall did not stay contained within its walls. It began to ripple outward, influencing conversations, perceptions, and expectations in ways that the palace may or may not have fully anticipated. And as we move forward, the focus shifts from what George did in that moment to what that moment means for the monarchy itself. So let me ask you this before we continue. Was this simply a powerful glimpse into the future, or was it the first quiet signal that the future has already begun? What happened inside Royal Albert Hall did not end when the lights dimmed or when the final notes of the orchestra faded into silence, because in many ways, that was only the beginning of a much larger shift that started unfolding the moment those images reached the public. And here's the question that immediately took hold beyond the walls of the hall. Why did this single appearance by Prince George resonate so deeply, and why did it feel different from every other carefully managed royal moment we have seen before? By the time the evening gave way to night, conversations had already begun to evolve, not just among royal commentators, but among ordinary viewers who sensed that something subtle yet significant had taken place. It was not the scale of the event, nor the grandeur of tradition, but the authenticity of George's presence that captured attention in a way that felt almost disarming. People were not reacting to spectacle, they were reacting to sincerity. And that leads to a deeper thought. Have we reached a point where authenticity matters more than tradition itself when it comes to public trust in institutions? Social media, often quick to amplify drama or controversy, responded in an unexpectedly unified way. Instead of focusing on hierarchy or internal dynamics, the conversation centered around small, human moments, the way George held his posture, the way Catherine, Princess of Wales, leaned toward him during key moments, and the way he responded not with nervousness, but with calm awareness. These details, seemingly minor, became the defining narrative of the night. And if you think about it, why do such subtle moments resonate more strongly than grand speeches or public declarations? At the same time, traditional media outlets began framing the evening in language that hinted at something larger than a routine royal appearance. Analysts described it as a quiet transition, a phrase that began to circulate widely because it captured what many people felt but could not fully articulate. This was not a formal shift of power, not a declaration of responsibility, but something far more nuanced, a glimpse into how the monarchy might evolve without ever announcing that it is evolving. So here is the question worth asking. Can an institution redefine itself without ever explicitly saying so? As discussions deepened, attention naturally expanded beyond George himself and began to focus on the broader role of the Wales family within this changing narrative. Prince William, though physically absent, became part of the conversation in a way that almost amplified his influence rather than diminished it. Observers began connecting George's composure to William's long-standing emphasis on duty and emotional awareness, suggesting that what the public witnessed was not spontaneous, but the result of years of quiet preparation. And that raises an interesting point. Does true leadership show itself most clearly when it is not physically present, but visibly reflected in others? Catherine's role, however, drew perhaps the most consistent and layered attention. Commentators highlighted the precision of her presence, not in a critical sense, but in admiration of how deliberately she balanced guidance with restraint. She did not dominate the narrative, yet she shaped it. She did not seek attention, yet she directed it. This paradox became central to how the evening was interpreted, because it revealed a form of influence that operates beneath the surface. And here is something to think about. Could this quiet, almost invisible leadership style be exactly what the modern monarchy needs to remain relevant? Meanwhile, reactions from those within royal circles added further depth to the unfolding story. King Charles III was observed throughout the evening with expressions that many described as reflective rather than purely proud, suggesting an awareness of the generational transition that is gradually taking shape. His occasional glances toward George were analyzed not as simple gestures of affection, but as moments of recognition. Recognition of continuity, of responsibility, and perhaps even of inevitability. So consider this. How often do we witness a future being acknowledged before it is formally declared? The presence of Queen Camilla added another dimension that did not go unnoticed. Her composed, measured demeanor provided a contrast that fueled discussion, not necessarily because of what she did, but because of what she did not reveal. In institutions as layered as the monarchy, even neutrality can become part of the narrative. And that leads to an intriguing question. When everything is observed so closely, does silence itself become a form of communication? Beyond the royal family, one of the most powerful responses came from veterans and attendees who experienced the ceremony firsthand. Their reflections carried a different kind of weight, because they were not analyzing symbolism or institutional dynamics, they were responding to presence. Many described George as attentive, respectful, and genuinely engaged, emphasizing that his stillness during the most emotional moments felt sincere rather than rehearsed. And if you think about it, isn't that the ultimate test of such an appearance? Not how it looks, but how it feels to those who understand the meaning of the occasion most deeply. As the narrative continued to expand, comparisons with previous generations naturally began to surface. Some observers noted how different this moment felt compared to earlier royal introductions, which often carried a sense of formality or distance. In contrast, George's presence felt grounded, almost relatable, despite the immense weight of expectation surrounding him. And this raises a powerful idea. Could relatability become one of the defining strengths of future monarchy? Yet perhaps the most important shift was not in how the public viewed George, but in how the public began to view the future itself. For the first time, many people felt they were not just hearing about what the monarchy will become, but actually seeing the early shape of it in real time. Not through grand ceremonies, not through official statements, but through moments that felt unfiltered and genuine. And here is the question that naturally follows. If the future can be revealed so quietly, how many other moments like this have we overlooked in the past? As this wave of reaction continued to build, it became clear that the evening had done more than create a memorable image, it had subtly reframed expectations. The monarchy was no longer being viewed only through the lens of tradition, but through the lens of transition. A transition that is gradual, intentional, and deeply human. And as we move forward, the focus begins to shift once again, this time toward what may have been happening behind the scenes that allowed such a moment to unfold so seamlessly. Because moments like this rarely happen by accident, especially within an institution built on precision and symbolism. So let me leave you with this thought before we continue. Was this truly a spontaneous glimpse into the future, or was it a carefully shaped moment designed to introduce that future in the most natural way possible? What makes a moment feel effortless on the surface is often the result of decisions made far from public view, and that is exactly where the story now leads, because what unfolded at Royal Albert Hall did not simply happen by chance, it was shaped, refined, and quietly aligned long before Prince George ever stepped into that spotlight. And here is the question that begins to change everything. How much of what we witnessed was spontaneous, and how much of it was carefully prepared without ever appearing staged? Behind the scenes, the absence of Prince William was not just a logistical gap to be filled, it became an unexpected opportunity, one that required careful thought because the stakes were far greater than a single evening's appearance. Leaving such a significant ceremonial moment without representation from the Wales family would have created its own narrative, one of absence rather than continuity. So the decision had to do more than solve a problem, it had to strengthen the story of the monarchy itself. And this leads to an important thought. When institutions face unexpected gaps, Do they reveal weakness, or do they reveal adaptability? Sources close to palace planning suggest that the decision to involve George was not rushed, but deliberate, shaped through conversations that balanced symbolism with sensitivity. The goal was never to place pressure on him, but to allow him to experience responsibility in a controlled and meaningful way. That distinction matters, because there is a difference between being placed in a role and being introduced to it. And if you think about it, which approach creates stronger future leaders? Catherine's role in this preparation appears to have been central, not just in guiding George emotionally, but in shaping how the entire moment would unfold visually and symbolically. Her insistence on positioning him beside King Charles III was more than a seating choice, it was a statement without words. It placed George in direct proximity to the living embodiment of the crown, allowing him to observe not from a distance, but from within the core of the institution itself. And here is a question worth considering. Can proximity to responsibility accelerate understanding in ways that no amount of instruction ever could? At the same time, there was a conscious effort to avoid turning the evening into a spectacle centered around George. The approach taken by palace aides was notably restrained, limiting overt attention while allowing the moment to unfold naturally. Interestingly, this restraint had the opposite effect, because the less it was emphasized, the more people noticed. Curiosity grew, attention sharpened, and what might have been a quiet appearance became a focal point of the entire evening. So ask yourself this: why do moments that are not announced often feel more powerful than those that are? Meanwhile, far from London, William remained connected to the event in a way that added another emotional layer to the story. Though physically distant, his influence was present through the preparation that had clearly shaped George's behavior. Reports suggest that he followed the ceremony closely, aware that this was not just an appearance, but a milestone. And that brings us to a compelling idea. Can leadership be measured not only by what someone does, but by what they prepare others to do in their absence? As the evening unfolded exactly as planned, or perhaps more accurately, exactly as hoped, those within palace circles began to recognize that something significant had been achieved. Not in a dramatic or headline-driven way, but in the kind of subtle success that institutions value most. George had not only attended, he had adapted. He had not only observed, he had engaged. And most importantly, he had done so without disrupting the natural flow of the event. And here is the key question. When someone steps into responsibility so seamlessly, does it suggest readiness, or simply strong guidance? The ripple effects of this moment were felt almost immediately within internal discussions, where long-term planning began to shift, not drastically, but perceptibly. There was no sudden acceleration, no immediate expansion of duties, but there was a recognition that George's ability to handle such an environment had opened new possibilities. Carefully selected appearances, gradual exposure, and measured involvement are now being considered with a renewed sense of confidence. And this raises an important point. How do institutions decide the right pace for introducing the next generation? Catherine's influence continues to stand at the center of this evolving strategy, not as a visible architect, but as a guiding force whose understanding of timing appears remarkably precise. She has consistently demonstrated an ability to balance tradition with modern expectations, and this moment was no exception. By allowing George to step forward while ensuring he remained supported, she created a scenario where growth felt natural rather than imposed. And if you reflect on it, isn't that the essence of effective leadership? Creating conditions where others can succeed without feeling the weight of expectation? Even the subtle dynamics among other senior royals added depth to this behind-the-scenes narrative. The composed presence of Queen Camilla, the measured attentiveness of those observing, and the quiet acknowledgments exchanged throughout the evening all contributed to an environment where change was being recognized without being formally addressed. It was not a shift announced from a podium, but one understood through observation. And that leads to an intriguing question. When change happens quietly, does it become more powerful because it feels inevitable? As the night concluded, what remained was not just the memory of a successful appearance, but the realization that the monarchy had taken a step forward without disrupting its own rhythm. It had adapted without appearing to adapt, introduced without formally introducing, and evolved without declaring evolution. And that is perhaps the most fascinating part of all. Because as we move toward the final part of this story, the focus shifts once again, this time toward the broader meaning of what we have witnessed, not just for the royal family, but for the public perception of the monarchy itself. So before we continue, consider this carefully. If the future can be introduced so subtly, so naturally, and so effectively, then what does that tell us about where the monarchy is heading next? And by the time the final images from Royal Albert Hall began circulating across screens the next morning, something had already shifted in the public imagination. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt almost irreversible. Because what people were responding to was not just the presence of Prince George, but the feeling that they had just witnessed the earliest outline of a future monarch taking shape in real time. And here's the question that quietly settles in at this stage. When a single moment can reshape perception so quickly, does it reveal more about the individual, or more about what people are ready to believe? What made this moment so powerful was not ceremony, not protocol, and not even tradition, but the rare alignment between authenticity and expectation. Viewers were not asked to accept a narrative, they discovered it themselves through small, unfiltered details. The way George held still during silence, the way Catherine, Princess of Wales, guided without overt direction, and the way the entire scene unfolded without forcing attention. And if you think about it, how often does a global audience connect to something not because it is explained, but because it is felt? As conversations continued to grow, a broader realization began to take hold, one that extended far beyond a single evening. The monarchy, often seen as slow-moving and bound by tradition, suddenly appeared capable of subtle evolution, not through grand reforms, but through carefully timed moments that reveal change without announcing it. And this leads to a deeper reflection. Could this quiet, almost invisible evolution be the very strategy that ensures its survival in a modern world? The role of Prince William became even more significant in hindsight, because his absence no longer felt like a gap, but like a deliberate space that allowed something new to emerge. His long-standing approach to preparing his children, focusing on emotional awareness and grounded understanding, seemed to manifest clearly in George's behavior. It was not just about what George did, but about how naturally he did it. And that raises a compelling question. Does true preparation reveal itself most clearly when there is no one guiding in the moment? At the same time, Catherine's influence continued to define how the moment was understood. Her ability to remain both present and understated created a framework in which George could step forward without pressure. She did not direct attention, yet she shaped its flow. She did not claim the spotlight, yet she ensured it landed where it needed to. And perhaps this is where the deeper meaning begins to emerge. Could her role as a quiet architect of the future monarchy be just as significant as any formal title she will one day hold? Even the subtle reactions of King Charles III added to the sense that this was more than a fleeting moment. His measured glances toward George carried a weight that many interpreted as recognition, not just of a grandson, but of continuity. A continuity that is no longer distant, but gradually unfolding in visible ways. And here's something worth asking. When those at the highest level begin to acknowledge the next generation, does it signal preparation or acceptance that the transition has already begun? Meanwhile, the presence of Queen Camilla, composed and observant, added a layer of quiet contrast that only deepened the narrative. Her restraint became part of the story, reminding viewers that within any evolving institution, different responses coexist, some expressive, some reserved, but all contributing to the larger picture. And that brings forward another thought. When multiple perspectives exist within the same moment, does it make that moment more complex, or more real? As the public continued to reflect on what they had seen, one theme became increasingly clear. This was not about a child being introduced to duty, but about duty beginning to recognize the individual. George was not being shaped in front of the public, he was revealing what had already been forming behind the scenes. And that distinction is crucial, because it changes how the moment is remembered. So consider this. Are we witnessing the beginning of something new, or simply the first time we are able to see what has been developing all along? The image that ultimately stayed with people was not one of grandeur, but of connection. Catherine and George walking side by side, aligned in pace, calm in presence, and completely synchronized without needing words. It was simple, almost understated, yet deeply symbolic. A mother guiding, a son understanding, and a future unfolding not through announcement, but through experience. And if you reflect on it, isn't that how the most enduring legacies are built? Not through sudden change, but through steady, intentional moments. As we reach the end of the story, the focus naturally turns forward, because moments like this do not exist in isolation. They create expectations, they shape narratives, and they invite questions about what comes next. Will George appear more frequently in such roles, gradually becoming a familiar presence? Will the monarchy continue to introduce its future in similarly subtle ways, allowing the public to witness change as it happens rather than announcing it? And most importantly, How will this balance between tradition and modernity define the next generation of leadership? So let me leave you with this final thought. If the future of the monarchy can emerge so quietly, so naturally, and yet feel so powerful, then perhaps the real transformation is not in the institution itself, but in how we are learning to see it. And if you found yourself noticing the details, the gestures, and the deeper meaning behind this moment, then you are already part of that shift in perspective. So tell me in the comments, did this feel like a simple appearance to you, or did it feel like the first real glimpse of a future king stepping into his role? If you enjoyed this kind of deep, story-driven analysis where every detail matters and every moment reveals something bigger, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us, because the next chapter of this story may already be unfolding, and when it does, you will want to see it first.